Hello, my name is Colin Mayer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third event in the British Academy Future the Corporation Summit. Yesterday saw the publication of the final report of the Future the Corporation program. It set out the importance of a corporate purpose of profitably solving problems of people and planet, not profiting from creating them for business, society, and the environment in the 21st century, and the policies and practices for promoting them. Nowhere are these issues more important or challenging than in relation to new technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, social media, etc. It's therefore a particular pleasure to introduce Reid Hoffman. Reid has been associated with setting up many of the great global giants such as PayPal and Facebook, but he's obviously best known for being the co-founder of LinkedIn in 2002. Reid, it's a tremendous pleasure and privilege to do this fireside chat with you.
Colin, it's great to do this.
We first met, I think, some 14 years ago in Oxford, and since then the company you created has transformed people's lives around the world. Indeed, in an article in LinkedIn published in the FT just this week, it noted that the 18-year-old company continues to thrive and survive. In the past 3 years, LinkedIn has added about 200 million new users. Its annual revenues have nearly doubled to $10 billion. So what I'd like to do is to start off by asking you, when you set up LinkedIn, did you have a clear sense of the purpose of the company you were founding?
I did, and actually I've occasionally on LinkedIn written a bit about this, but I think that one of the things that is very useful for companies, all companies, technology companies especially, of course, as per the impact that technology is having on the world, to articulate what change in the world they're trying to do. And it's good to, frequently companies will think individual customers, like whether it's an individual or a company or something else, but it's good to think about like, okay, a customer as a unit, an industry as a unit, a society as a unit, the world as a unit, and say, how am I going to play across each of these things? And why is it when I succeed in building my business that I can do something that is beneficial at each of these levels, right? That the net positive impact is high. And there's all kinds of good business reasons for doing it. Your employees are highly motivated. You can recruit dedicated people to working on it. Your people partnering with you, obviously governments and interacting with you. And so, with LinkedIn, the notion was, how do we allow every individual to take better control of their work and their career path and their economic? How do we make that more efficient for matching the right talent with the right opportunities at corporations? How does that help industries become innovative? And how does that increase the GDP productivity? We have a project at LinkedIn called LinkedIn Cities that like organizing around cities as a very concrete element about like, what industries are growing and shrinking, what skills need to happen, what economic programs a city might run, what safety nets a city might run, et cetera, all the way up into societies and global commerce. So it was very focused as an extension of what our products were to what kind of mission and impact we'd have across this entire level within the world.
And did that change over time, or was that purpose pretty much constant as the company grew?
What I would say is it evolved, but it evolved primarily with, we kind of started with, well, maybe we'll only really help with kind of matching, kind of talent and opportunities. And then we started realizing, okay, well, as we would hoped, we got to a broader platform. So now we'll add in upskilling and reskilling and education as part of it. Now we'll add in, kind of ability for people to find, like being independent contractors, ability to match, that kind of consultancy with work that needed to happen. You always, in entrepreneurship, you start small. It's like tax preparation or, career consulting or other kinds of things. And then building those in, because we'd always thought about LinkedIn as a network, as a platform. So threads got added in, but this notion of economic, kind of evolution got there. And then one of the benefits of the Microsoft LinkedIn combination is we'd been thinking about, for example, what our negative contribution in climate was relatively small because it's a relatively tight computational window within servers, but then benefiting as part of being part of Microsoft's carbon neutrality, which is Microsoft has done a tremendous amount of work to say the very first thing is how do we get to carbon neutral across all of Microsoft, all of its supply chains, all of its server data centers and everything else, and doing a deeper study than most people do, because they kind of say, well, we bought some trees. It's like, well, if those trees were going to live there anyway, you actually didn't contribute to the withdrawal of carbon. You actually have to have a much more understanding of your supply chain. And so we started benefiting from that too, which you could say is an evolution, but it's not. It was something we were thinking about, but not doing as an independent company at LinkedIn at the time.
And do you think that social media platforms in general have a clear sense of purpose, moving beyond LinkedIn?
Well, they do have, I think, a clear sense of purpose usually, but the question that I think is a good one is, does it play across all the different levels? So, for example, obviously a lot of the criticism in the last few years has been around social media, Facebook, Twitter, other things like that, saying, well, it's spreading misinformation, it's allowing democracy to be hacked in bad ways. There's a set of different things, and nothing more present than obviously what's going on with science and vaccinations, and the fact that getting vaccinated is a very good thing, and is not just an individual health thing, but as a public health thing. And so I think perhaps what the social media stuff, they had like principles around freedom of speech, expression of individuals, the notion that voices that couldn't be heard before, that might have been shut out of kind of the editorial of mainstream media, et cetera, can now do that. And that you could connect with people you knew, you could share pictures and like be reconnected with friends and family on a more ongoing basis. Those are principles that are attempting a social good, a vision of the world. Mm-hmm. I think one of the questions is how do you answer the question of, well, as it scales, does it get to what's its impact as it plays out across society, as it plays out across, key functions, for example, like vaccination and so forth. And do you have the right solutions to that? And I think so far, that's clearly a work in progress. That's the optimistic way of putting it. But I actually think that one of the things that I most worry about in, what is sometimes referred to as techlash is, look, the solution is by reshaping the technology and building the technology of the future. It's precisely one of the things that I love about the British Academy's purposeful corporation. It's like, no, it isn't that corporations are a problem, or it isn't that capitalism problem. It's you have to shape it, because you have to have your solution match your problem in terms of scale and innovation and investment and all the rest. So it's like, okay, how do we get the technology to do the right things here? And then, of course, there's this underlying question, which I think the social media companies frequently ask is, all right, well, we can intervene in, call it, society level space, but what's the ethics by which we can do this? How do we get the moral authority? Like if we say, well, we're going to go suppress all of these individuals who are saying, I think vaccines are terrible, what gives us the moral authority to do that? How do we do that? Now, obviously, you can get that through government, but you need something, kind of clearly articulated through government, which, in the last administration was a little chaotic and very uncertain.
And I think this is getting really to the heart of the issue. Do you think then that tech companies have to wait for governments to give them a guidance as to where the boundaries should lie, or should they be trying to identify themselves ahead of government?
So my hope is that they could do it ahead of government, because you've got this whole spectrum where you get to all the way to government articulating a clear principle, because tech companies are, of course, free enterprises. And so you can say, well, we think the following kinds of things are really true, and so we're going to start implementing. And I loved some of what Twitter was doing, which was, kind of saying, well, look, we're not going to censor anything other than more extreme. But when someone puts up a claim, even a public figure like the former president puts up a claim that is anti-science, we'll put a little box around it that says, get the facts. right? So, and over here is where you get the faxes. And there was this huge outcry in the US. This was censoring conservative voices. And you're like, well, if conservative voices are anti-fact, then I'm fine. Maybe if you agree with, that's anti-fact, then fine. And so, but that kind of thing, I think, is a way that companies can do it while kind of threading the needle of saying, how do we help with, because you need a media ecosystem that gets to, that is an improving dynamic truth function. Doesn't mean everything's true, just like as in media itself, just as in scholarship itself. Mistakes are made, things are said that aren't true, but it's like you need the system to be dynamically improving over time. And so the question is, how do you get there? And I think one of the things that they could start doing is saying, well, here are some principles that we're following. Here are some metrics and dashboards. I actually think that one of the things that if I were to suggest something to the British Academy work, and also thinking about to regulators, is don't think about lists of thou shalt and thou shalt not. Think about dashboards. Think about what's the dashboard that you would set up to start having the kind of more positive social impact that you'd want, because then it's measurable. And then, by the way, we have simple mechanisms already with companies for addressing this. So for example, if a company came out and said, we're going to do X, and by the way, our auditors are going to check us on doing X and certify that, right? And here's the metrics that we're doing it. You could do that even without government regulation, because we already have in companies an auditing function, not only for public companies, where obviously it's super important, but in private companies. And auditors are by nature like, well, are we disciplined? And if we were questioned by other knowledgeable auditors who looked the same data we did, would they say the same thing, for this? And that there's a whole profession around that. So I think there's ways to get to it before governments. And, one of the problems, of course, is when you get governments intervene. This is a classic, Western view. When you have governments intervening in speech, you have to be very careful. Now, libertarians, sorry, a little bit of a long answer, because we have a bunch of this thread within Silicon Valley. They say, oh, regulating speech is terrible. And you're like, well, no, we regulate speech all the time. Like, for example, let's take truth in advertising. We regulate truth in advertising. Oh, I meant political speech. Like, okay, but like, then you have to be careful about what's political speech. Is vaccine as public health? Is that political speech? That seems to me to be scientific speech. Now, doesn't mean science is always right, right? There's a whole thing, dynamic improving. But right now, you talk to anyone who's knowledgeable and smart, they say, oh, these vaccines, these are a good idea. And these are essential for health. So let's get on board with that. Anyway, so that's a quick, broad brush, answer. And I'm happy to go in any depth on any of that.
And do you think that the tech companies would be willing to subject themselves to that sort of increased external auditing of what they're doing?
I think they're going to need to. And I think that part of what happens, it's kind of a change of when you become a social utility, when you become part of how society runs, you need to maintain that trust. And the best way to maintain that trust is to say, not just because, when someone says, you meet a stranger and they lean across the table and they say, trust me. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's a little concerning. When someone else is saying, look, I'm cross-checking the work and I don't have an interest in it. That's part of the reason why I have accounting, right? And, and auditing and so forth. And they say no. When they say that, I validated it. It's trustful. And so whatever the mechanism is getting there, whether it's kind of self-attestation to a set of principles, industries, like I'm a big advocate of public-private things, like, doing parallels to the Motion Pictures Association, to say, here's principles that we're doing, so it can be public and private, can operate at a higher level, and with some intelligent negotiation, bringing in other stakeholders like academic researchers and so forth to try to get it right, and say, yes, this is what we're doing, and here's the people who are telling you that we're actually making progress against the dashboards and metrics. And I think that any future is going to have something like that. Now, where it is between the companies themselves saying, we've identified it, kind of trade associations going, okay, we've all agreed to this, and we've brought in a bunch of people, to government saying, thou shalt. That is, I think, still a dynamic range. But I think the notion of reporting against these, to use the Academy's metrics, purposeful metrics, right, is, I think, a certain future.
And do you think their investors will let them do it? They're making a lot of money out of the $1 trillion companies.
Well, I think most of the investors would like to have kind of more, call it certainty and dynamic positivity in the company. So it's the question of cost and trade-off. I mean, one of the things that makes business and capitalism work very well is that by paying attention to making sure that, you know, what's your yield per cost. Like classically, of course, this is in products. You know, I sell for X, you know, cost me Y, I get margin, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But that focus on cost and pricing is one of the things that's made capitalism create so much productivity. So it's not irrational for businesses, capitalist societies to actually focus on cost as a legitimate issue. Now, that being said, it's okay, look, what are the costs that were imposed here that could then allow the companies to continue to innovate, build new products, build new revenue versus uncertain environments versus, you know, kind of destabilized democracies, which is obviously terrible for business, right? For these kinds of things. And so, and so I think the short answer is yes, but you're working out what the cost benefit is. And what I think we need to do is we need to move to a thing where, as opposed to it being oppositional, there's more collaboration. Part of the reason why I focused on dashboards as a kind of as a good focus versus we'll pass this rule, now shall not do this, is because like, okay, what's the dashboard that we should be trying to maximize? And then, you know, the company might say, well, this thing that you want, the cost is very, very high on it. Like, I want a human individual to look at every single thing that's posted. It's like, well, that's crazy. And by the way, if you try to do that, you'll be silencing tons of important voices. You'll be silencing, you know, diverse voices. You'll be silencing a bunch of stuff. So maybe not that, but maybe there's a cheaper way to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, and then figuring that out within the dashboards of what you're doing.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely right. Let's now turn from avoiding the negatives to the positives, because a lot of people are looking to the tech companies basically to solve the world's problems. Do you think we're putting too much faith in them?
Well, you know, it's only people. So there's a bit of a challenge on that. Although the classic thing that I think people mistake is they go, look, all organizations have strengths and weaknesses. Governments have strengths and weaknesses. Nonprofits and NGOs have strengths and weaknesses. Corporations have strengths and weaknesses. There's different sets of strengths and weaknesses, how do we align the problems to the strengths and weaknesses? One of the things that I love about the kind of purposeful business stuff is say, well, businesses are very good at moving towards revenue, profitability, simple metrics, aligning to that as a way of doing it. So if we can align that to the Sustainable Development Goals, certain climate, certain kinds of social goods as a way of doing it, then that's something that we can make work. Now, it has to be simple and compact, because if you had a long list of, you must just solve all the woes that everybody in this big diverse society thinks is there, that just not going to work. Right? It's partially that focus and iteration and development, thinking about cost and price and benefit for it, that's part of what works. And so there's some problems that the tech companies will be very good at, and there's other problems that the tech companies won't be as good at. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, kind of like I support a variety of things, like, for example, in artificial intelligence. You know, there's a Turing Institute in London. There's the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute at Stanford, you know, and so forth, as ways of trying to get in public interest and other kinds of, because there's different strengths and weaknesses to each of these organizations. Now, that being said, there's an important asterisk here, which is too often when people get to new technologies, they go, oh my God, I worry about this negative impact. Let's slow it down. And it's like, no, how do we get the technology to the right shape? So for example, when you get to climate change, like everyone goes, well, a lot of lawyers say, well, what we really need is a treaty that everyone agrees to use less carbon. I frankly just don't see how that's going to work. You've got, you know, China and India with people coming into the middle class, which is a good global progress, producing steel and concrete, and just like, how is that global treaty going to work? You need a technological answer. You need like pulling carbon out of the atmosphere with clean energy. You need a cheaper production of concrete and steel for carbon impact. You need abilities to clean the ocean and a set of different things. And so what you want on all, I think, countries is you want these moonshots. Now, part of what we've actually been seeing happening, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, is that tech companies can do really great R&D functions, and a tech company together with a venture industry ends up creating things that weren't like feasibly capitally before. Robotics revolutions happening now, and actually, in fact, one of the great trends I've seen in the last decade, even within Silicon Valley, is energy investing. How do you try to make fission and fusion safe, because that's a backup for clean energy. And so I think there's a bunch of stuff that companies can do, and tech stuff can contribute, and in particularly a bunch of stuff within technological development for that. And I think having, like, and again, purposeful corporation nudging and having that go in the right ways is, I think, a very, very good thing. But to say that tech companies will solve us or save us, right? Like, no, we all have to work on this together, and different organizations have different roles to play to make this happen.
And do you think that working together should be public and private, government and business working close together?
Generally speaking, the patterns that I see best are when kind of public sets kind of some broad goals, asks for certain kinds of accountability, asks for certain kinds of deliverables, and then the private then kind of iterates within that. And the reason is because there's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. So one of the problems, of course, on the political side is you can be captivated by what politicians need for running their campaigns, or for what sounds as a good slogan, because to go back to very ancient British comedic history, the burn the witch from Monty Python, is a kind of a classic, kind of thing that happens, and it causes all kinds of misfunction when government is trying to run programs. And on the other hand, of course, you've got if all that matters is the money that I put in my pocket, and all I'm trying to do is get money out of it, you can get misfunction from the corporate side too. So the question is how do you designing the public private combinations so that you get each of the strengths supplied the right way. And it doesn't mean perfectly, never perfectly. There's always error. There's always things. That room for error is one of the things that I think that happens in that. Now, classically, when someone tells me, well, we'll try to get the best of both worlds, if you have a possibility of the best of both worlds, you also have the possibility of the worst of both worlds. So you have to put real work into that. And that was one of the reasons when I was gesturing earlier about public-private, I was also like, well, I think this is one of the roles that universities and academies can contribute well, because they can contribute kind of the equivalent of what, at least in the U.S., is called the blue ribbon, commission experts, to participate in this as another designer, activity, whistleblower, thinker, researcher, to make it happen. And I think that's part of what can make the public-private stuff orient much more towards the best of both worlds versus the worst.
Right. Okay. Well, let's just take a few examples and see how far technology can really help. So let's consider creating rather than destroying good jobs, and giving fairer access to the most disadvantaged members of society, left behind places, etc. Do you see technology as contributing or exacerbating those problems?
Well, part of the reason why, of course, is a good question, is the short answer, as technology exists today, the answer is both, right? And there's definitely exacerbating as well as trying to help. And the question is, we need to kind of figure out, like, how do we have it help more? Now, that being said, for example, when you look at as a Amazon center gets more automated, there are actually more human jobs in it. Right, because the humans adapt in all these different ways. Now, there's this higher shipping of packages per human being in the thing. That's part of productivity. That's the productivity that we generate by making each form of business more efficient. It's just like, for example, in LinkedIn, you have recruiters, and then by making recruiters 5x more efficient, it doesn't mean that the number of recruiter jobs go down, but it means that they are all now capable of doing a lot more, right, in order to make stuff happen. And that's part of the kind of productivity of it. Now, that being said, one of the central things that I would like academia and industry and government to solve is the notion of how do you create the right kinds of incentives for corporations to create the right kinds of jobs, right? Because you say, well, in these gig economies, we're treating labor as a cost. We're trying to drive the cost low. We kind of patch it with minimum wage and some other things, but it's a natural thing to how to drive the cost low. It's like, well, how do we also then create a reward function, purposeful, for creating good jobs? I think that's doable, and you need to have different, I think, frankly, probably experiments to try to see which of them work in order to make that happen. Now, that's one thing I think can be done more on this. I think another one is, part of what you have to do is you have to look at what the nature of the problem is and then say, what are the parts that are nature of the solution? So I do think that it's not utopian to be thinking about, well, how do we, for example, really invest in a set of technologies to help people get the right skills and adaptation to be able to be in jobs in the future. Like, this is one of the things that we're doing, with the kind of the LinkedIn Cities project. One of the reasons we kicked it off, I think it was even 10, 12 years ago now, that we said, okay, let's study what the growing skills are and be able to provide that map. I think Manchester, speaking of local to the UK, is one of the cities that we're, I think, working with, and say, okay, which skills are trending up? Okay, so why don't you orient your resources to helping workers develop and build those skills, because it takes some time to do that, because we got the future trend, and that will help the industries that are growing in your particular area and help the economic prosperity. And so I think, and that's, by the way, gives you another instance of kind of public-private partnership as a way of doing that. And so, and then LinkedIn is trying to figure out how to make skilling for workers cost effective, easy to use, etc. You can also think about ways that you can say, well, let's try to get our venture capitalists and our entrepreneurs incented in this mechanism, because incentive mechanisms and the design for that is the way to try to generally make this happen. It's part of the reason why, like, let's make the profit incentive aligned, right? So anyway, so those are some gestures, but that's not saying that there aren't also, as you get new technological transformations, it does change the workforce, and it does mean that companies on cost stuff are trying to reduce all costs, which include labor costs. And that's one of the things that you need to deliberately put some energy into. Well, how do we get it so that it's also making sure that creating good jobs is part of it too?
Okay, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but a couple of quick questions, if I may. AI is obviously going to be much more than about jobs. It's going to be about the way we think, and extent to which it's actually going to take over human thinking. Do you worry about profit-driven AI firms in the future of the human race?
Well, I do, except that I personally have gone and made connections with all the heads of all the labs of all the major companies. I also serve on the board of OpenAI, which is trying to catalyze this in the right way. So I actually think the people there are also paying attention to this and are paying attention to, like, kind of like, there's this term within AI of the misalignment problem, and also like safety. And they're paying attention to all aspects of it, including, like, OpenAI runs a kind of a universal basic income study. Not to say that's the necessary outcome, but like, what are the different ways that if we're doing displacement, that we can create safety nets for people in the right way? And so, like, concern, yes. Worry, well, I actually think we can win this game collectively as a society.
Okay, thank you. And to end on a somewhat more personal note, if I may, you're purported to have once said, and I have no idea if it's true, that individuals should think of themselves as businesses of one and be the CEO of their own career.
That is actually right. It's my first book, The Startup of You.
Okay. What's your own purpose now, and what are you seeking to achieve in the next stage of your life?
Well, because I read a lot of science fiction as a child, I tend to have this absurdly ambitious purpose, which is, how do I help humanity at scale? And what I mean that is virtues like compassion and wisdom and knowledge and so forth. And all the economic underpinnings, all like LinkedIn, everything else, are a really important part of that. How we get to these more noble purposes as we take care of economics and we grow prosperity. And so I'm still on that. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, I've been doing so much in AI, everything from the corporations to a bunch of universities and nonprofits.
That was fantastic. Reid Hoffman, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure and privilege. Thank you.
Colin, thank you.
Businesses should provide stability to the employees that they've got.
Something continually rolling to help within the community as well.
Incorporate other brands that are also doing the same sort of thing.
Mental health care.
We're willing to act charitably in our minds, but not really putting our words into action sometimes.
I think it's really important for businesses to be transparent and that it's constantly, rated.
If corporations put their purpose at the heart of everything that they do, it will make them think very differently about their social and environmental impacts.
So I think there's lots that we do in terms of the way in which we operate. From our carbon footprinting, we get that independently verified, and 100% of our profits are given to Water Aid.
I suppose the key thing about being purpose-driven, it gives you that framework for the right sorts of decisions in order for you to fulfil that purpose.
The challenge we have at the moment is that we need to rewrite the rules so that all businesses are behaving responsibly.
We can't deliver on our purpose of providing sustainable long-term returns for our clients if we invest in companies who are seeking short-term profits and creating problems for society.
If we want to build forward together, we have to have a sense of urgency across board.
And we need to pivot very quickly to a model of capitalism that is regenerative and restorative, and we need new, bold, fresh ideas to frame how we build that new economy. And the future of the corporation is providing that insight and that intelligence.